The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Hangar 7, casting harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor of Ramstein Air Base. Lieutenant Maya Reyes moved methodically through the maintenance bay, her clipboard gripped firmly as she checked inventory against the morning's requisition forms. Her sleeves were rolled up in the warmth of the hangar, revealing a network of jagged scars that ran along both forearms like lightning frozen against her skin. Private First Class Derek Jenkins watched from across the bay, a smirk playing on his lips. Fresh out of tech school with top marks, he'd arrived at Ramstein 3 weeks ago with a cohort of equally green airmen who hung on his every word. His service uniform was still crisp, unworn by the rigors of real deployment. His confidence, however, far exceeded his experience. "Check out Lieutenant Papercuts," Jenkins snickered to his audience, gesturing subtly toward Reyes. "What kind of maintenance officer looks like they lost a fight with a paper shredder?" His friends laughed on cue, their voices carrying just far enough to be heard, but not quite far enough to be called insubordination. They were getting comfortable in their new posting, learning how far they could push boundaries without crossing them completely. Reyes approached their section, her gait steady and purposeful. She didn't look at Jenkins or his friends directly, but something in her posture suggested she had heard every word. "Stand at attention when an officer passes," barked Staff Sergeant Davis from nearby, his voice cutting through the chatter. The group straightened half-heartedly, more performance than respect. As Reyes passed, Jenkins couldn't help himself. Something about her calm demeanor, her apparent refusal to acknowledge his barbs, made him push further. "Careful with those maintenance reports, Lieutenant," he called out just loud enough to be heard. "Looks like you already lost one fight with some paperwork." The hangar didn't fall silent. It never completely did, but a noticeable hush spread among the nearby senior enlisted. Conversations paused. Tools stopped moving. Eyes darted between Jenkins and Reyes. Reyes paused, turning slowly to face Jenkins. Her expression wasn't angry or offended, just quietly assessing. Their eyes met for a long moment, hers steady, his increasingly uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate why. There was something in that gaze, something that made his skin prickle with an unfamiliar sensation. She said nothing, simply continued her rounds. "Man, what's her problem?" Jenkins muttered, trying to shake the strange feeling her gaze had left him with. An older crew chief nearby spoke without looking up from his work. "You might want to ease up, kid." "What for?" "She's just a maintenance officer. Probably got those scars falling into a file cabinet." The crew chief shook his head, but said nothing more. His silence spoke volumes, but Jenkins was too cocky to hear what wasn't being said. Throughout the morning, Reyes continued her duties with quiet efficiency. She helped a young airman troubleshoot a diagnostic system, her instructions clear and patient. She updated inventory logs, coordinated with supply, and signed off on completed maintenance tasks. She moved through the hangar like a ghost present, but somehow separate from the casual camaraderie that flowed around her. Jenkins watched her periodically, his curiosity growing despite himself. He noticed how the senior NCOs treated her differently than other officers. There was none of the grudging respect or behind-the-back eye-rolling that usually accompanied interactions with lieutenants fresh from officer training. Instead, they spoke to her with a deference that seemed out of proportion to her rank. They listened when she spoke. Later that morning, all personnel were called to the daily briefing in the command center. Jenkins found himself seated near the back, surrounded by his usual group of friends. They exchanged quiet jokes as the room filled, their attention more on each other than on the officers assembling at the front. Colonel Harrington, the base commander, took his position at the podium. "Good morning, people. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started." The briefing proceeded with the usual updates on operations, maintenance schedules, and security protocols. Jenkins found his attention wandering until Colonel Harrington began discussing a classified component failure on one of the new stealth drones. The thermal signature is unavoidable with the current configuration, Harrington explained confidently, pointing to a technical diagram displayed on the screen behind him. We'll need to adjust mission parameters to account for this limitation. From the back of the room, Reyes cleared her throat softly. Sir, if I may. All heads turned. Lieutenant Reyes rarely spoke during these briefings. Go ahead, Lieutenant, Harrington said, a hint of impatience in his tone. The signature issue could be mitigated by reversing the intake manifold orientation, Reyes suggested, her voice calm and assured. It worked on the earlier prototype. The blueprints in archives confirm it would be compatible with the current model. Harrington paused, then nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. I'd forgotten about that solution. Make it happen. Jenkins watched the exchange with growing confusion. Since when did full-bird colonels defer to lieutenants on technical matters? And how did a maintenance officer have such detailed knowledge of classified drone systems? As the briefing ended and personnel began filing out, Jenkins found himself watching Reyes more closely. She gathered her materials efficiently, exchanged a few words with a captain from intelligence, and headed for the door. Something didn't add up. The respect she commanded from senior personnel, her detailed knowledge of classified systems, the way she moved, those scars, they told a story that contradicted everything her rank and position suggested. But Jenkins was too arrogant to consider that maybe, just maybe, he was missing something important. 2 days later, Jenkins's curiosity had only grown stronger. He found himself watching Lieutenant Reyes during their shifts, noting details he'd previously dismissed. The way she moved with an economy of motion that seemed almost tactical. How her eyes constantly swept their surroundings, as if assessing threats that existed only in her mind. The respectful nod she received from passing pilots and senior officers. You're obsessing, man, his bunkmate Tommy Rodriguez said as they headed to the mess hall for lunch. It's weird. Something's not right about her, Jenkins insisted, lowering his voice as they passed a group of senior NCOs. Did you see how Colonel Harrington backed down during the briefing? When's the last time you saw a colonel take technical advice from a lieutenant? Maybe she knows her stuff, Rodriguez shrugged. Some people are just good at their jobs. But Jenkins couldn't let it go. During the afternoon shift, he positioned himself where he could observe Reyes working with a team of technicians on an F-35's diagnostic system. Her knowledge was encyclopedic. She referenced technical manuals from memory, identified problems before the diagnostic computers flagged them, and explained complex systems with the fluency of someone who'd spent years mastering them. Impressive, isn't it? Jenkins turned to find Master Sergeant Wilkins watching him watch Reyes. She's thorough, Jenkins admitted grudgingly. Wilkins chuckled. Thorough, that's one word for it. He studied Jenkins for a moment. You know, kid, I've been on this base for 12 years. Seen a lot of officers come and go. Some talk a big game, others just do the work. Lieutenant Reyes? She's something different. Different how? But Wilkins had already turned away, leaving Jenkins with more questions than answers. That evening, Jenkins decided to do some digging. He headed to the base library, a small, rarely used facility that maintained physical copies of technical manuals and operational histories. If there were answers to be found about Lieutenant Reyes, maybe he could find them here. He started with the personnel directories, looking for any mention of her previous assignments. The official records were sparse maintenance officer training, a brief stint at Edwards Air Force Base, then assignment to Ramstein. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the deference she commanded. But as he dug deeper into the technical archives, he found something interesting. Several maintenance protocols bore her signature as a contributing author. These weren't simple procedural updates. They were sophisticated, technical innovations that had been adopted Air Force-wide. The dates on the documents went back several years, but they were classified at levels far above what a maintenance lieutenant should have access to. Finding everything you need, Private? Jenkins spun around to find Staff Sergeant Davis standing. Behind him, arms crossed. Just doing some research, Sergeant. Trying to understand our maintenance protocols better. Davis glanced at the open manuals, his expression unreadable. Commendable. Education is important. He paused. Though some knowledge comes with responsibilities you might not be ready for. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering, Davis picked up one of the technical manuals Jenkins had been reading. You know, some of the best soldiers I've ever served with were the ones nobody talked about. The ones who did their jobs without fanfare, without recognition. Sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows. Jenkins felt that familiar prickle of unease. Are we still talking about maintenance protocols? Davis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We're talking about understanding your place, Private, and knowing when to ask questions and when to simply observe and learn. After Davis left, Jenkins sat alone in the empty library, staring at the technical manuals. Every instinct told him he was missing something crucial, something that would explain the contradictions he observed daily. But the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Jenkins arrived at the hangar to find an unusual level of activity. Senior officers huddled in quiet conversation. NCOs moving with purposeful urgency and an undercurrent of anticipation that he couldn't identify. What's going on? He asked Rodriguez, who was already at his workstation. Word is we're getting an inspection. Some big shot from European Command is making an unscheduled visit. Jenkins felt his stomach drop. Inspections meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant his recent behavior toward Lieutenant Reyes might come under review. He'd been careful to stay just within the bounds of military discipline, but he knew his attitude had been noted by the senior NCOs. Throughout the morning, the base transformed. Every surface was polished, every procedure double-checked, every uniform pressed to perfection. Jenkins threw himself into the preparation, hoping that demonstrated competence might offset any concerns about his attitude. Lieutenant Reyes, he noticed, seemed oddly calm amid the chaos, while other officers rushed to prepare briefing materials and update status reports. She continued her regular duties with the same methodical efficiency she always displayed. If anything, she seemed less concerned about the inspection than anyone else on base. Doesn't she care? Jenkins muttered to himself as he watched her calmly explaining a repair procedure to a nervous technician. About what? Rodriguez asked. The inspection. Everyone else is running around like their career depends on it, and she's acting like it's just another day. Rodriguez followed his gaze. Maybe she's got nothing to worry about. Maybe when you're that good at your job, inspections don't scare you. But Jenkins sensed it was more than confidence. There was something in Lieutenant Reyes' demeanor that suggested she was operating on a different level entirely, as if the normal concerns of military hierarchy and career advancement simply didn't apply to her. As the day progressed, Jenkins found himself watching her more intently, looking for clues that might explain the mystery that had consumed his thoughts for days. He was so focused on his observation that he almost missed the announcement that would change everything. All personnel to the command center, came the voice over the intercom. General on deck in 15 minutes. Jenkins felt his heart rate spike. This was it, the inspection that would determine his immediate future. As he filed into the command center with the rest of the base personnel, he caught sight of Lieutenant Reyes taking her position near the maintenance coordination terminal. She stood at attention like everyone else, her expression neutral and professional. Nothing in her bearing suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a competent maintenance officer doing her job. But Jenkins had learned to look closer. And in that moment, just before the doors opened and everything changed, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. For just a split second, as Lieutenant Reyes glanced toward the entrance, Jenkins saw something in her. Eyes that he'd never seen before. Not fear, not anticipation, but a kind of weary recognition. As if she knew exactly who was about to walk through those doors and what their arrival would mean. The doors swung open, and Jenkins's world shifted on its axis. Attention on deck. The command center snapped to rigid attention as General Maxwell Thornton strode through the entrance, his 4-star insignia catching the fluorescent light. His entourage of high-ranking officers followed in perfect formation, their ribbons and medals creating a kaleidoscope of military achievement across their chests. Jenkins stood frozen among the rows of personnel, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was no routine inspection. General Thornton commanded all of European operations, the kind of brass who only appeared when something significant was happening. Colonel Harrington stepped forward, his voice crisp with military precision. "Welcome to Ramstein, General. We're honored by your visit." "At ease," General Thornton replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding others. "This isn't a formal inspection, Colonel. I was in the area for the NATO conference and thought I'd drop by to see how our finest European base is functioning." The room relaxed marginally, though Jenkins noticed the senior NCOs remained alert. General Thornton began his walkthrough, nodding at officers, occasionally stopping to ask questions about specific operations. Everything proceeded according to protocol until the general's eyes fell on Lieutenant Reyes. Jenkins watched in fascination as the general's confident stride suddenly faltered. His eyes widened with unmistakable recognition, and his authoritative demeanor shifted to something approaching shock. "My God," General Thornton said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. "Phantom, is that really you?" The words hit the command center like a physical force. Jenkins felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been punched. Around him, senior officers exchanged glances of recognition and awe, while the junior enlisted looked on in confusion. Phantom. The name triggered fragments of half-remembered stories. From basic training whispered legends of impossible missions, of an operator whose tactical genius had become the stuff of military folklore. Someone whose real identity was classified so far above Jenkins's pay grade that even knowing the name was probably illegal. "It's good to see you, sir," Lieutenant Reyes replied quietly, her voice steady despite the bombshell that had just detonated around her. Then General Thornton did something that shattered every convention of military protocol Jenkins had ever learned. The 4-star general, commander of thousands of troops across Europe, rendered a crisp salute to Lieutenant Reyes. Jenkins felt his knees go weak. You didn't salute downward, ever, unless the person standing before you had earned something so extraordinary that normal rules no longer applied. "Colonel Reyes," General Thornton said warmly, and Jenkins's world completed its violent transformation. "Colonel, not Lieutenant. Colonel." The fragments of stories came rushing back with horrifying clarity. Operation Blackstone. The rescue mission that saved an entire diplomatic delegation. The operator whose call sign had become legend, known only as Phantom for operational security. The woman who'd done things so classified that most people didn't even know her real name, and Jenkins had been mocking her for weeks. "Sir." Colonel Reyes, because she was a colonel, had always been a colonel, responded quietly. She glanced briefly around the room, noting the stares, the confusion, the dawning recognition on some faces. "I would prefer to keep my current assignment, if that's acceptable." "Of course," General Thornton nodded, understanding immediately. "But surely they could have given you something more appropriate than maintenance." "I requested this assignment, sir. I prefer it." Her voice carried a finality that suggested the topic wasn't open for discussion, not even with a four-star general. General Thornton smiled knowingly, still avoiding the spotlight. Some things never change. He turned to address the room. For those of you who don't know, you've been working alongside one of the finest tactical minds in our military. Colonel Reyes led operations that most of you have only heard whispers about, the kind that change history without making it into the history books. Jenkins thought he might vomit. Every joke, every smirk, every condescending comment came flooding back in vivid, mortifying detail. Even mocking not just an officer, but a living legend. Someone who had done things he couldn't even imagine, sacrificed in ways he would never understand. The general continued, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Colonel Reyes was the architect behind Operation Blackstone, which some of you senior officers might be familiar with. For the rest of you, let's just say that when our country needed someone to do the impossible, they sent Phantom. Throughout this revelation, Colonel Reyes maintained her composure, standing straight but looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. It was the most emotion Jenkins had seen her display since his arrival at the base. "Sir, perhaps we could continue this conversation privately," she suggested, her voice respectful but firm. "Always the professional," General Thornton chuckled. "Very well. Colonel Harrington, might we use your office?" "Of course, General," Harrington replied, gesturing toward his private office. His voice had changed, Jenkins noticed. There was new deference there, not just for the general, but for Colonel Reyes as well. As they walked toward the office, Colonel Reyes passed directly by Jenkins. He couldn't meet her eyes, shame burning through him like acid. The quiet maintenance officer he dismissed was one of the most decorated soldiers in the entire military. The scars he'd mocked were proof of sacrifices that had saved lives he would never know about. When the office door closed, the command center erupted into whispered conversations. Senior NCOs explained to confused junior enlisted who Phantom was, while officers huddled in groups, discussing the implications of having such a legendary figure quietly working on their base. "I told you to ease up," the crew chief from the hangar appeared beside Jenkins, his voice not unkind but carrying an unmistakable note of "I told you so." "I didn't know," Jenkins managed, his voice barely a whisper. "That was the point," the crew chief replied. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you do know?" Jenkins had no answer. He stood paralyzed, replaying weeks of arrogance and disrespect, seeing each incident through the lens of this devastating new understanding. The woman he dismissed as just a maintenance officer was someone who belonged in the same conversation as the greatest military heroes in American history. And he had laughed at her scars. 20 minutes later, the office door opened. General Thornton emerged first, followed by Colonel Harrington and Colonel Reyes. Their expressions revealed nothing, but there was a new energy in the room. "Continue with your duties," General Thornton announced. "Colonel Reyes will remain in her current position, as she prefers. I expect each of you to maintain operational security regarding her identity and background. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, she's Lieutenant Reyes, maintenance officer. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," came the unanimous response. General Thornton nodded, satisfied. "Lieutenant," he said, emphasizing her cover rank with a small smile, "perhaps you'd join me for the rest of my tour?" "Of course, sir." As they walked toward the exit, General Thornton paused near Jenkins. The general's penetrating stare made Jenkins feel completely transparent. "What's your name, son?" Jenkins snapped to attention. "Private First Class Jenkins, sir." General Thornton studied him for a moment, then looked at Colonel Reyes. Something passed between them, an unspoken communication that Jenkins couldn't decipher, but somehow knew involved him. "Carry on, Private," the general finally said before continuing toward the door. Jenkins remained at attention until they'd left the command center, then slumped against the nearest wall, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Staff Sergeant Davis approached, his expression stern but not unkind. "You look like you could use some air, Jenkins." "Yes, Sergeant." Outside, the German sunshine felt surreal after the tension of the last hour. Jenkins leaned against the building, trying to process what had just happened. "I really messed up, didn't I?" he asked Davis. "Spectacularly," Davis agreed without hesitation. "But you're not the first cocky recruit to learn a hard lesson. You probably won't be the last." "Those scars," Jenkins said quietly. "They're not from paperwork accidents." Davis gave him a look that suggested Jenkins was stating the obvious. "No, they're from pulling people out of burning vehicles under enemy fire. From operations that people like you and me will never hear about. From sacrifices most of us can't even imagine." Jenkins felt the full weight of his ignorance crushing down on him. Why would someone like that be working maintenance at Ramstein? She could be anywhere, doing anything. Davis shrugged. "Some questions don't have easy answers. Some people run toward the spotlight. Others run away from it. The ones who run away are usually the ones who've seen things the rest of us can't imagine." "What do I do now, Sergeant?" "You do your job," Davis replied simply. "You learn from this, and maybe you think twice before judging someone based on what you think you know about them." As Jenkins stood in the afternoon sun, processing the magnitude of his mistake, one thought echoed in his mind above all others. Colonel Maya Phantom Reyes had endured weeks of his mockery and disrespect without saying a word. She could have destroyed him with a single conversation with any senior officer on the base. Instead, she'd simply done her job. That, Jenkins realized, said more about her character than any medal or commendation ever could. The next morning, Jenkins arrived at the hangar 30 minutes early. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams of burning vehicles and faceless heroes, punctuated by the echo of General Thornton's voice saying, "Phantom." He'd spent the night researching what little he could find about Operation Blackstone. Most details were classified, but the fragments available painted a picture of the impossible made routine. Colonel Reyes was already at her station, reviewing maintenance logs with the same methodical efficiency she displayed every day since his arrival. The only difference was how others treated her now. Senior NCOs approached with a deference that went beyond her visible rank. Officers who'd barely acknowledged her before now sought her input on technical matters. She handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she'd shown his mockery, neither encouraging it nor seeming bothered by it. "You're early, Jenkins," Staff Sergeant Davis observed as he entered the hangar. "Couldn't sleep, Sergeant." Davis nodded knowingly. Learning the truth can do that, especially when the truth is uncomfortable. Throughout the morning, Jenkins found himself unable to concentrate on his assigned tasks. His eyes kept drifting to Colonel Reyes, seeing her now, as if for the first time. The scars that had been objects of his cruel humor were battle wounds, proof of courage he couldn't comprehend. Her quiet efficiency wasn't the work of someone hiding from responsibility, but someone who carried more responsibility than most people could imagine. Around midday, Master Sergeant Wilkins approached Jenkins's workstation. "Walk with me, son." They stepped outside the hangar into the crisp German air. Aircraft thundered overhead on approach, the sound familiar and comforting after weeks on base. "You've been carrying yourself differently since yesterday," Wilkins observed. "It's been a learning experience, Sergeant," Wilkins chuckled. "That's one way to put it. You know, I served with the Colonel with Lieutenant Reyes before. She came here." Jenkins stopped walking. "You did?" "Not directly, but our paths crossed during her transition back to regular operations." She'd been out of the maintenance world for several years, working in specialized fields. When she requested return to maintenance, a lot of people thought she was crazy. Why would someone with her background want to work on aircraft diagnostics? Why did she? Wilkins was quiet for a moment, watching a formation of F-16's taxi toward the runway. Some people find peace in fixing things, Jenkins. After years of being asked to break things, people, situations, enemy operations, maybe she wanted to remember what it felt like to make something work again. The insight hit Jenkins like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on what he perceived as Colonel Reyes' diminished status that he'd never considered it might be her choice. That someone with her background might actively seek the quiet satisfaction of maintenance work over the recognition she'd undoubtedly earned. She requested this assignment, Jenkins said, more to himself than to Wilkins. She did. And she's been the best maintenance officer this base has ever had. Not because of her background, but because she approaches every task like lives depend on it. Because for her, they often did. That afternoon, Jenkins volunteered for every assignment. That might put him in Colonel Reyes' vicinity. Not to observe her like some curiosity, but hoping for a chance to somehow make amends for weeks of disrespect. The opportunity came when she was assigned to oversee diagnostics on a problematic F-35 system. Private Jenkins, you're familiar with this diagnostic protocol, she said, her voice neutral and professional. Yes, ma'am. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to apologize for my previous behavior. It was inappropriate and disrespectful. Colonel Reyes looked at him directly for the first time since the general's visit. Apology noted, private. Now let's focus on the task at hand. She didn't accept his apology, but she didn't reject it either. Instead, she redirected them both toward work, which, Jenkins was beginning to understand, was how she approached most situations. They worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour, Colonel Reyes patiently guiding him through diagnostic procedures he thought he understood, but was now learning at a much deeper level. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, not just because of her maintenance background, but because she'd learned to see systems holistically, how every component affected overall performance, how small problems could cascade into mission-critical failures. You're thinking too linearly, she said, as Jenkins struggled with a complex diagnostic sequence. This system doesn't fail in straight lines. It fails in patterns. Learn to see the patterns. It was the most guidance she'd given him since his arrival, and Jenkins found himself grateful for the opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise went far beyond anything he'd encountered. Near the end of their shift, Colonel Reyes received a call on her secure radio, something that hadn't happened in the weeks Jenkins had been observing her. She listened briefly, her expression unchanged, then replied with a simple understood. I need to step away briefly, she told Jenkins. Continue with the diagnostic sequence. Log your findings. She disappeared for nearly 2 hours. When she returned, there was something different about her demeanor, a slight tension that hadn't been there before. Jenkins noticed but didn't comment, focusing instead on completing his assigned tasks to the best of his ability. That evening, as the base settled into its nighttime routine, Jenkins found himself walking past the maintenance bay on his way to the barracks. Through the windows, he could see Colonel Reyes still at work, alone with what appeared to be classified technical manuals spread across her workstation. She wasn't just maintaining equipment, he realized. She was studying it at a level that went far beyond routine maintenance protocols. Whatever expertise had made her legendary in special operations, she was applying it to understanding every system under her care. The next morning brought news that added another layer to Jenkins's growing understanding. During the daily briefing, Colonel Harrington announced that the F-35 diagnostics Colonel Reyes had been working on had identified a potential system vulnerability that could have compromised multiple aircraft. Thanks to Lieutenant Riai's thorough analysis, Harrington said, maintaining her cover identity, we've avoided what could have been a serious operational setback. Jenkins watched as Colonel Reyes received the acknowledgement with the same quiet professionalism she showed everything else. No pride, no satisfaction, just the calm acceptance of someone who'd done their job. But Jenkins was beginning to understand that for Colonel Reyes, doing her job meant approaching every task with the same tactical precision that had made her legendary. Whether she was planning an impossible rescue mission or diagnosing aircraft systems, she brought the same relentless competence to bear. After the briefing, Staff Sergeant Davis approached Jenkins. "Starting to understand?" "I think so, Sergeant." "She doesn't do anything halfway, does she?" "Excellence isn't something you turn on and off, Private. It's either who you are or it isn't." The colonel, the lieutenant, she's never learned how to be anything less than extraordinary. Jenkins nodded, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he'd witnessed these past weeks. Colonel Maya Phantom Reyes hadn't been hiding from her past achievements. She'd been applying the same standards that had made those achievements possible to every mundane task in her current assignment. He'd mistaken quiet excellence for mediocrity, dedication for diminished ambition. The woman he'd mocked wasn't someone who'd settled for less. She was someone who made everything she touched better, regardless of whether anyone noticed or cared. And that, Jenkins was learning, was what real leadership looked like. 3 weeks had passed since General Thornton's visit, and Ramstein Air Base had settled into a new normal. Colonel Reyes continued her work as Lieutenant Reyes, but the base's understanding of her had fundamentally shifted. Jenkins noticed it in small details: how conversations quieted when she entered rooms, how senior officers sought her input on matters well beyond maintenance, how even the base commander deferred to her expertise. Jenkins himself had transformed. Gone was the cocky recruit who'd mocked what he didn't understand. In his place was someone genuinely committed to learning, not just from Colonel Riai's technical expertise, but from her approach to military service itself. The opportunity for deeper learning came when Colonel Harrington assigned Jenkins to work directly under Colonel Reyes on a classified project. A series of equipment failures across multiple European bases suggested either systematic problems or potential sabotage, and her unique background made her the ideal person to investigate. "This stays between us," Colonel Reyes told Jenkins as they reviewed classified maintenance logs in a secure conference room. "What we're looking for are patterns that others might miss." "What kind of patterns, ma'am?" "The kind that suggest human agency rather than random failure." She spread technical diagrams across the table. "These failures share characteristics that could indicate deliberate action. We need to determine if that's the case." Working alongside Colonel Reyes on this investigation gave Jenkins unprecedented insight into how her mind operated. She approached the data like a detective, looking for connections that weren't immediately obvious, considering possibilities that others would dismiss as unlikely. "Here," she said, pointing to a maintenance log from a base in Italy. "This failure happened exactly 48 hours after a similar one in Spain. Same component, same failure mode, but different aircraft types. Could be coincidence," Jenkins suggested. "Could be, but coincidences in operational security usually aren't." She pulled up another set of data. "Look at the timing. Always during shift changes, always on equipment scheduled for deployment within 72 hours. Jenkins studied the patterns she was highlighting. Individually, each incident seemed routine, the kind of equipment failures that were unfortunate, but expected. Collectively, they painted a picture of systematic compromise. "Someone sabotaging our aircraft," he said. "Possibly. But we need proof before we make accusations." Colonel Reyes gathered the documents. "This requires careful investigation." The wrong approach could alert whoever's responsible. Over the next several days, they worked together to build a comprehensive case. Colonel Reyes taught Jenkins to think like an analyst, to see beyond surface appearances and consider multiple hypotheses simultaneously. Her methodology was rigorous and patient, the same approach that had made her legendary in special operations. Military intelligence is about understanding your adversary, she explained as they reviewed security footage from various bases. Not just their capabilities, but their thinking. What motivates them? How do they plan? What vulnerabilities do they exploit? Jenkins found himself completely absorbed in the work. This wasn't routine maintenance. This was the kind of high stakes problem solving that made military service meaningful. And he was learning from someone whose tactical genius was the stuff of legend. The breakthrough came when Colonel Reyes identified a pattern in personnel schedules. "Look at this," she said, highlighting data on her computer screen. Every incident occurs during shifts supervised by contract maintenance personnel from the same company. Titan Aerospace Solutions. Jenkins read from the screen. They handle maintenance contracts across 6 European bases. And they have access to exactly the kinds of systems we've seen compromised. Colonel Reyes leaned back in her chair. We need to investigate their personnel, but carefully. If we're right, some of their people are foreign agents. The magnitude of what they'd uncovered hit Jenkins like a truck. They weren't just dealing with equipment failures. They were looking at potential espionage that could compromise American military operations across Europe. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We build an airtight case and present it through proper channels." Colonel Reyes began organizing their evidence. "This goes to counterintelligence, and they take over the investigation. Will we be involved in whatever comes next?" Colonel Reyes looked at him directly. "That depends on what counterintelligence finds. But Jenkins, you need to understand something. This kind of work, it's not glamorous. There are no headlines, no recognition. Most of the time, successful operations are the ones nobody ever hears about." Jenkins nodded, finally understanding something crucial about Colonel Reyes's worldview. Her legendary status came from operations that remained classified, victories that would never be publicly acknowledged. She'd spent her career doing vital work that brought no recognition, and she'd chosen to continue that pattern in her current assignment. The next morning, Colonel Reyes presented their findings to Colonel Harrington and a team of counterintelligence specialists who'd arrived from USAFE headquarters. Jenkins was included in the briefing, a recognition of his contribution that filled him with quiet pride. "The pattern is clear," Colonel Reyes explained, displaying their analysis on the conference room's main screen. 17 incidents across 6 bases, all involving critical components, all occurring during shifts supervised by Titan Aerospace personnel. The lead counterintelligence officer, a stern woman named Major Patricia Coleman, studied the data intently. "This is solid work, Lieutenant. How confident are you in these conclusions?" 93%, Colonel Reyes replied without hesitation. "The statistical probability of these incidents being coincidental is less than 7%. Major." Coleman nodded approvingly. "We'll take over from here. Both of you are to maintain complete operational security regarding this investigation." "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," both Jenkins and Colonel Reyes replied. As the meeting concluded, Jenkins felt a sense of completion, unlike anything he'd experienced in his military career. They'd identified a serious threat to operational security, built an unshakable case, and handed it off to the appropriate authorities. It was exactly the kind of work that made military service meaningful. Walking back to the maintenance bay, Colonel Reyes was quieter than usual. "Something bothering you, ma'am?" Jenkins asked. "Just thinking about patterns," she replied. "How people see what they expect to see and miss what's actually there." Jenkins understood she wasn't just talking about the sabotage investigation. "You mean like how I completely misjudged you when I first arrived?" "Among other things." She paused outside the hangar entrance. "You've grown since then, Jenkins. You're starting to understand what military service actually means. I had a good teacher." Colonel Reyes smiled, the first genuine smile Jenkins had seen from her. "You did the work. I just provided guidance." 2 days later, Jenkins learned that 3 contract employees from Titan Aerospace had been quietly arrested at various European bases. The investigation they'd initiated had uncovered a sophisticated espionage operation that had been compromising American military technology for months. None of it made the news. There were no headlines about the threat they'd identified or the lives their work had potentially saved. The success was measured in missions that would proceed safely, aircraft that would function as designed, operations that would succeed because the threat had been eliminated. It was exactly the kind of victory Colonel Reyes had spent her career achieving, vital, necessary, and invisible. 1 month after the counterintelligence operation, Jenkins had fully integrated into Colonel Reyes's maintenance team. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by genuine competence and a deep respect for the work they were doing. He'd learned to see beyond surface appearances, to approach problems with the same systematic thinking that characterized Colonel Reyes's methodology. The test of his growth came unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning when a new group of airmen arrived at Ramstein for assignment. Jenkins watched them disembark from the transport aircraft, recognizing his former self in their eager faces and pristine uniforms. They carried themselves with the same mixture of confidence and naivety that had marked his own arrival. Among them was Airman First Class Brandon Walsh, a communications specialist fresh from technical training at Keesler Air Force Base. Like Jenkins had been, Walsh was intelligent, capable, and completely convinced of his own importance. Within hours of his arrival, he'd established himself as the group's informal leader, regaling his new colleagues with stories of his academic achievements and predictions about his rapid rise through the ranks. Jenkins first encountered Walsh in the base exchange, where the new airman was loudly complaining about his temporary assignment to assist with maintenance operations. "I didn't go through advanced communications training to work on aircraft diagnostics," Walsh announced to his audience. "They should have people qualified for this kind of work." "They do," Jenkins said quietly, approaching the group. "You're..." Looking at one of them, Walsh sized up Jenkins, noting his relatively junior rank and maintenance assignment, and dismissed him with a condescending smile. "No offense, but I'm talking about real technical work. Complex systems that require actual expertise." Jenkins felt a familiar flash of irritation, then remembered how wrong his own assumptions had been. "You might be surprised by the level of expertise in the maintenance division. I'd recommend keeping an open mind." "Sure," Walsh replied with barely concealed sarcasm. "I'm sure it's very educational." The next morning, Walsh reported to the maintenance bay for his temporary assignment. Jenkins watched as Staff Sergeant Davis briefed the new arrivals on safety protocols and work assignments. Colonel Reyes was introduced as their supervising officer, and Jenkins could see Walsh's immediate dismissal of her authority based on her apparent rank and assignment. "Great," Walsh muttered to a colleague. "We're supervised by a maintenance lieutenant. This should be challenging." Jenkins positioned himself where he could observe Walsh's first interactions with Colonel Reyes. The pattern was sickeningly familiar, the barely concealed disrespect, the assumption that maintenance work was beneath his capabilities, the complete failure to recognize excellence when it was standing right in front of him. During the morning briefing, Colonel Reyes outlined their current projects with her usual methodical precision. When she mentioned a complex diagnostic issue, with the base's new communication array Walsh's supposed area of expertise, The airman interrupted. If I may, I think there might be a more efficient approach to that problem. At Kiesler, we worked with similar systems, and the solution is usually pretty straightforward. Colonel Reyes regarded him calmly. Go on, Airman Walsh. Well, most communication failures are simply power distribution issues. Check the primary feeds, reset the system parameters, and you're usually good to go. Interesting theory, Colonel Reyes replied. What would you do if the problem persisted after those steps? Walsh shrugged confidently. Wouldn't happen. Like I said, it's usually pretty straightforward. Jenkins watched Colonel Reyes's expression remain perfectly neutral, but he'd learned to read the subtle signs of her growing assessment of Walsh's competence, or lack thereof. She was giving him rope, allowing him to demonstrate exactly how much he didn't know. Very well, she said. Airman Walsh, you'll be working with Private Jenkins on the communication array diagnostics. Perhaps you can implement your straightforward solution. As the briefing concluded, Jenkins approached Walsh with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted to let the airman learn the hard way, as he had. But he also remembered Staff Sergeant Davis's patience with his own ignorance, and the example Colonel Reyes had set in dealing with his disrespect. Listen, Walsh, he said quietly. I know the lieutenant seems young for the position, but she really knows her stuff. You might want to... Thanks for the advice, Walsh interrupted. But I think I can handle basic maintenance supervision. How hard can it be? The communication array was located in a restricted area of the base, requiring special clearance to access. As they approached the facility, Jenkins tried once more to prepare Walsh for what they were about to encounter. This isn't your typical communication system, he explained. It interfaces with classified networks and has security protocols. Right, Walsh said dismissively. Look, I appreciate that you guys take this seriously, but I've worked with military communications my entire career. I'm sure I can figure it out. Inside the facility, Walsh's confidence began to waver. The system was far more complex than anything he'd encountered in training. A sophisticated array that managed communications not just for Ramstein, but for coordinated operations across multiple European bases. The diagnostic interfaces alone required security clearances Walsh didn't possess. Okay, he admitted after studying the system for several minutes. This is more complicated than I expected, but the basic principles are the same. Jenkins watched as Walsh attempted to implement his straightforward solution, systematically working through power distribution checks and parameter resets. None of it addressed the actual problem, which Colonel Reyes had identified as a subtle interference pattern that suggested either sophisticated jamming or component degradation. After 2 hours of failed attempts, Walsh was becoming increasingly frustrated and defensive. There's something wrong with this system, he declared. The interfaces aren't responding correctly to standard protocols. Maybe that's because they're not standard protocols, Jenkins suggested gently. This system operates on classified communication standards. The diagnostic procedures are different. Then why didn't someone tell me that? Walsh snapped. The lieutenant mentioned it during the briefing. She said this was a complex diagnostic issue requiring specialized knowledge. Walsh's face reddened as he realized his earlier confidence had blinded him to crucial information. So what do we do now? We ask for help, Jenkins replied. And we listen when we get it. Colonel Reyes arrived within minutes of their request for assistance. She assessed Walsh's work quickly and efficiently, noting both what he'd attempted and what he'd overlooked. Your power distribution analysis was thorough, she said diplomatically. But this system failure is more subtle. The interference pattern suggests coordinated frequency targeting, either equipment degradation or deliberate jamming. She moved to a diagnostic terminal Walsh hadn't even noticed accessing screens that required her personal security codes. Within 10 minutes, she'd identified the source of the problem, a component failure in a classified subsystem that was causing signal bleeding across multiple frequencies. "How did you know to check that?" Walsh asked, his earlier condescension replaced by grudging respect. "Experience," Colonel Reyes replied simply. "This kind of failure pattern usually indicates cascade effects from secondary systems. The obvious solutions rarely work because they're addressing symptoms rather than causes." As she worked to coordinate the repair, Walsh watched with growing amazement. Her knowledge wasn't just comprehensive, it was strategic, approaching each problem as part of a larger system that had to function perfectly under any conditions. "Ma'am," Walsh said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about this assignment that were completely wrong." Colonel Reyes looked at him directly. "Assumptions are dangerous in any context, Airman. In military operations, they can be fatal. The question is what you learn from recognizing them." Jenkins felt a surge of pride, watching Walsh's expression transform from arrogance to genuine respect. It was exactly the same journey he'd taken, guided by the same patient professionalism Colonel Reyes showed everyone who worked with her. As they walked back to the main maintenance bay, Walsh was unusually quiet. "I really screwed up, didn't I?" he finally asked Jenkins. "Not as badly as I did when I first got here," Jenkins replied honestly. "The difference is you recognized it after one morning instead of weeks of being an idiot." "What's her story?" "I mean, how does a maintenance lieutenant know more about advanced communications than someone who just finished specialist training?" Jenkins smiled, remembering his own confusion at the contradictions. "That's a longer story than I can tell you. But the short version is that sometimes the most capable people are the ones who don't need to prove it to everyone around them." That evening, Walsh sought out Jenkins in the barracks. "I've been thinking about what happened today," he said. "I came here thinking I was going to teach these maintenance people about real technical work. Instead, I learned more in one morning than I did in weeks of training." "Lieutenant Reyes has that effect on people," Jenkins agreed. "She makes everyone around her better at their jobs. Is she really just a maintenance officer?" Jenkins chose his words carefully, remembering the operational security requirements surrounding Colonel Reyes's background. "She's exactly what she appears to be, one of the most competent officers you'll ever serve under. Everything else is just details." Walsh nodded slowly. "I think I understand. Some people earn respect through what they do, not what they claim they can do." "Now you're getting it," Jenkins said. "And if you stick around and actually listen, you might learn enough to be worth something." The next morning, Walsh reported to the maintenance bay with a completely different attitude. Gone was the condescending superiority, replaced by genuine eagerness to learn. Jenkins watched as Colonel Reyes assigned him to work with experienced technicians, pairing his theoretical knowledge with their practical expertise. It was exactly how she'd handled Jenkins's own transformation, not by breaking down his arrogance, but by giving him opportunities to see beyond it. Watching Walsh's integration into the team, Jenkins realized how far he'd come since his own arrival at Ramstein. He'd learned not just technical skills, but something more valuable: how to recognize excellence regardless of how it was packaged, and how to contribute to something larger than his own advancement. Colonel Reyes, he understood now, had been teaching him far more than maintenance procedures. She'd been demonstrating what military service looked like when it was about mission, accomplishment rather than personal recognition. And that lesson, Jenkins knew, would serve him long after his assignment at Ramstein ended. 2 months had passed since Airman Walsh's arrival, and he'd integrated seamlessly into Colonel Reyes's maintenance team. Like Jenkins before him, Walsh had discovered that true expertise often came without fanfare, and that the most valuable lessons were taught by example rather than lecture. The final test of Jenkins's transformation came during the annual European Command Inspection, a comprehensive evaluation that would determine Ramstein's operational readiness rating. Unlike General Thornton's informal visit, this was a formal assessment that could affect the base's mission assignments and resource allocation. Jenkins had been selected as one of the enlisted representatives for the inspection team's technical interviews. It was an honor that reflected his growth over the past months, but it also meant he would be questioned by senior officers who knew nothing about Colonel Reyes' background or the exceptional work being done in the maintenance division. The inspection team was led by Brigadier General Robert Crawford, a no-nonsense officer known for his exacting standards and impatience with excuses. His team included senior officers from multiple disciplines, each focused on evaluating specific aspects of base operations. Private First Class Jenkins, General Crawford addressed him during the technical interview. "I understand you've been working closely with the maintenance division. What's your assessment of their operational capabilities?" Jenkins felt the weight of the moment. This was his opportunity to represent not just his own work, but the exceptional leadership he'd experienced under Colonel Reyes. "Sir, the maintenance division operates at the highest level of efficiency and expertise I've encountered in my military career," he began. "Our diagnostic accuracy rate exceeds Air Force standards by 12%. And our component failure prediction system has prevented multiple operational disruptions." "Impressive statistics," General Crawford replied. "What accounts for this performance level?" "Leadership, sir. We have supervising officers who approach every task with tactical precision and ensure that every team member understands how their work contributes to mission success." General Crawford made notes on his evaluation form. "And you feel confident in the division's ability to support expanded operations if required?" "Absolutely, sir. Our team has successfully identified and resolved complex technical issues that other bases have struggled with. We're prepared for any operational requirements." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Jenkins fielding questions about specific procedures, training protocols, and equipment readiness. Throughout, he found himself drawing on lessons learned from Colonel Reyes, not just technical knowledge, but her approach to systematic problem-solving and attention to detail. After the interview, Jenkins felt cautiously optimistic. He'd represented his division well, but the real test would come when the inspection team evaluated their actual operations. That afternoon, the inspection team toured the maintenance facilities. Jenkins watched nervously as General Crawford and his officers observed routine operations, questioned technicians, and reviewed maintenance logs. Colonel Reyes accompanied them throughout, answering questions with her usual calm competence. "Lieutenant Reyes," General Crawford said during their tour of the diagnostic bay, "your maintenance logs show unusually detailed analysis for routine procedures. What drives this level of documentation?" "Prevention, sir," Colonel Reyes replied. "Comprehensive documentation allows us to identify patterns that might indicate emerging problems. It's more efficient to prevent failures than to respond to them. Show me an example." Colonel Reyes led them to a workstation where Walsh was analyzing diagnostic data from an F-35 system. Airman Walsh has identified a trend in component temperatures that suggests potential cooling system degradation. The components are still within acceptable parameters, but the pattern indicates we should replace the cooling unit during the next scheduled maintenance cycle. General Crawford studied the data. This component isn't scheduled for replacement for another 6 months. "Correct, sir. But replacing it now prevents the possibility of in-flight failure and potential mission compromise. That's expensive preventive maintenance, Lieutenant. Less expensive than losing an aircraft to system failure, sir." Jenkins watched the exchange with growing admiration. Colonel Reyes was demonstrating exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made her legendary in special operations, applied to the seemingly mundane world of aircraft maintenance. General Crawford seemed impressed despite his initial skepticism. This level of analysis requires significant expertise. How do you train your personnel to think this systematically? We focus on understanding systems holistically rather than just individual components, Colonel Reyes explained. Every technician learns to see how their work affects overall mission capability. As the tour continued, Jenkins noticed the inspection team's growing appreciation for the maintenance division's capabilities. They questioned procedures that exceeded standard requirements, only to discover that each innovation improved efficiency or prevented potential problems. The climax came when General Crawford asked to see the diagnostic work on the communication array that Walsh had initially fumbled. Colonel Reyes presented their analysis of the interference patterns they'd identified, explaining how they'd traced the problem to cascade effects from a failing secondary system. This kind of analysis typically requires specialized technical intelligence support, General Crawford observed. How did your maintenance team develop this capability? Jenkins held his breath, wondering how Colonel Reyes would answer without revealing her background. Experience with complex systems teaches you to look beyond obvious solutions, she replied simply. Most problems that appear mysterious are actually straightforward once you understand the underlying relationships. General Crawford nodded. Slowly, I'm beginning to understand why this base consistently exceeds performance metrics. That evening, the inspection team presented their preliminary findings to the base leadership. Jenkins wasn't present for the briefing, but the results became clear the next morning when Colonel Harrington addressed the entire base. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce that Ramstein has received the highest operational readiness rating in European Command, Harrington declared. Special commendation goes to our maintenance division for demonstrating exceptional capability and innovation. The announcement was met with applause and genuine celebration. Jenkins felt a surge of pride that went beyond personal recognition. They had collectively achieved something extraordinary under Colonel Reyes's leadership. Later that day, General Crawford sought out Colonel Reyes for a private conversation. Jenkins happened to be working nearby and couldn't help overhearing portions of their discussion. Lieutenant, your division's performance is remarkable, General Crawford said. I'm recommending you for accelerated promotion and assignment to a more challenging position. I appreciate the consideration, sir, but I'm content with my current assignment. Surely someone with your capabilities should be pursuing greater responsibilities. I believe I'm making my greatest contribution right here, sir. This work is important, and I'm good at it. General Crawford seemed puzzled by her response, but he nodded respectfully. Very well, but I want you to know that your expertise is being wasted in a routine maintenance position. Jenkins smiled to himself. If only General Crawford knew that Colonel Reyes' routine maintenance position was exactly where her extraordinary capabilities were needed most. After General Crawford left, Jenkins approached Colonel Reyes. Congratulations on the commendation, ma'am. You've built something special here. We've built something special, she corrected. This isn't the work of one person. Still, you turned down a promotion opportunity. Most officers would jump at the chance for advancement. Colonel Reyes looked at him thoughtfully. What do you think advancement means, Jenkins? Moving up in rank, taking on greater responsibilities, getting recognition for your achievements. And if you're already doing the work that matters most to you, where's the advancement in leaving it for something less meaningful? Jenkins considered this. Throughout his time at Ramstein, he'd learned that Colonel Reyes defined success differently than most people. For her, excellence wasn't about climbing hierarchies or accumulating recognition. It was about doing important work as well as it could possibly be done. You're saying that doing the right work well is more important than getting promoted? I'm saying that if you're fortunate enough to find work that matters and that you're good at, leaving it for something you care about less isn't advancement. It's a step backward. That evening, Jenkins reflected on his journey since arriving at Ramstein. He'd begun as an arrogant recruit convinced of his own importance, mocking a maintenance officer he'd assumed was beneath his notice. Through Colonel Reyes's patient example and unwitting mentorship, he'd learned to see beyond surface appearances, to value competence over recognition, and to understand that the most important work often happened without fanfare. He'd also learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding attention or demanding respect. It was about making everyone around you better at their jobs and more committed to shared mission success. Most importantly, he discovered that some of the most extraordinary people were the ones who chose ordinary assignments and made them exceptional through the quality of their commitment. As Jenkins prepared for sleep, he realized that his time at Ramstein had taught him lessons that would guide the rest of his military career. Colonel Maya Phantom Reyes had shown him what military service looked like when it was about something larger than personal advancement. And that knowledge, Jenkins understood, was worth more than any promotion or commendation he might ever receive. 6 months had passed since the inspection that had earned Ramstein Air Base its exceptional rating, and Jenkins was preparing for his own reassignment. His tour at Ramstein was ending, and he'd received orders for advanced technical training that would prepare him for greater responsibilities in his career. The news of his departure had spread quickly through the maintenance division, and his colleagues had planned a small farewell gathering. But before that celebration, Jenkins wanted to have one final conversation with the officer who had fundamentally changed his understanding of military service. He found Colonel Reyes in the maintenance bay after hours, working alone on diagnostic reports for the next day's operations. She looked up as he approached, setting aside her paperwork with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. "Private Jenkins," she acknowledged. "I understand congratulations are in order. Advanced technical training is an excellent opportunity." "Thank you, ma'am. I wanted to talk with you before I left, if you have a few minutes." "Of course. Have a seat." Jenkins settled into a nearby chair, suddenly uncertain how to articulate everything he wanted to say. "When I first arrived here, I thought I knew what military service was about. I was focused on advancement, recognition, proving I was better than the assignments I was given." Colonel Reyes listened without comment, giving him space to find his words. "You changed all that," he continued. "Not through lectures or formal mentoring, but by example. You showed me what it looked like to excel without needing credit, to lead without demanding recognition, to serve something larger than personal ambition. You did that work yourself, Jenkins. I simply provided an environment where you could learn." "That's exactly what I mean," Jenkins said with a slight smile. "Even now, you deflect credit for something you accomplished. You took an arrogant recruit who was mocking you behind your back and turned him into someone who actually understands what military service means." Colonel Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what I see when I look at you now compared to the person who arrived here 8 months ago?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then, I saw someone with technical ability but no understanding of purpose. Someone who measured success by external validation rather than meaningful contribution. Now, I see a soldier who approaches problems systematically, who values competence over recognition, and who understands that the most important work often happens without applause." Jenkins felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with having earned the respect of someone whose opinion he'd come to value above all others. "What advice do you have for my next assignment?" he asked. "Remember that every position is an opportunity to excel, regardless of how prestigious it appears. Look for the work that matters and do it better than anyone expects. And never assume you understand someone's capabilities based on their visible rank or assignment. Like I did with you. Like you did with me, she agreed. But more importantly, like you'll never do again. Jenkins nodded, understanding that this conversation was marking the end of one phase of his military career and the beginning of another. Will you stay here at Ramstein? For now. This work is important, and I'm making a contribution that matters to me. Even though you could be anywhere, doing anything? Colonel Reyes smiled, one of the rare, genuine expressions Jenkins had learned to recognize, especially because I could be anywhere. Having choices makes the choice you make more meaningful. The farewell gathering that evening was smaller than some military send-offs, but it carried a warmth that Jenkins found more meaningful than larger, more formal celebrations. His colleagues in the maintenance division had become more than co-workers. They'd become a team united by shared commitment to excellence and guided by leadership that inspired rather than commanded. Staff Sergeant Davis presented Jenkins with a small plaque recognizing his contributions to the division's success during the European Command inspection. Master Sergeant Wilkins shared stories about Jenkins's growth from an arrogant recruit to a valued team member. Even Airman Walsh, who'd experienced his own transformation under Colonel Reyes's guidance, spoke about the example Jenkins had set for newer arrivals. But the moment that meant the most came when Colonel Reyes approached Jenkins privately as the evening was winding down. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small wrapped package. Inside was a technical manual on advanced diagnostic procedures, not the standard Air Force publication, but a specialized text used by expert technicians. On the inside cover, she'd written, "For Jenkins, excellence is a choice, not an accident. Make it every day." "This is too much, ma'am," Jenkins said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "It's a tool," she replied simply. "Use it to make others better at their jobs, the way you've learned to do here." The next morning, Jenkins reported for his final day of duty at Ramstein. He spent the morning completing transition procedures and briefing his replacement on ongoing projects. By afternoon, he was ready to depart for his new assignment. As he made his final walk through the maintenance bay, Jenkins reflected on the transformation he'd undergone in this seemingly ordinary hangar. He'd arrived as someone who judged others by their apparent status and assumed that recognition was the measure of worth. He was leaving as someone who understood that the most important work often happened in the shadows, performed by people who found meaning in excellence itself rather than external validation. His final stop was Colonel Reyes's office, where she was reviewing maintenance schedules for the coming week. "Ma'am, I'm ready to depart. Thank you for everything you've taught me." "Safe travels, Jenkins. Make us proud." "I will, ma'am." "And, ma'am?" "Yes?" "For what it's worth, I think the Air Force is lucky to have you exactly where you are, doing exactly what you're doing." Colonel Reyes nodded, and Jenkins thought he saw a flicker of something gratitude, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement, that her choice to serve quietly had been understood and appreciated. As Jenkins boarded the transport aircraft that would take him to his next assignment, he carried with him more than technical knowledge and professional experience. He carried an understanding of what military service could be when it was guided by purpose rather than ambition, and when excellence became its own reward. 6 months later, at his new base in Japan, Technical Sergeant Jenkins, recently promoted ahead of schedule, found himself supervising a maintenance team that included several young airmen fresh from technical training. They reminded him strongly of his former self, confident, capable, and completely convinced of their own importance. One of them, Airman Rebecca Torres, had been making disparaging comments about their commanding officer, a quiet major who'd been assigned to maintenance duties after a career in logistics. Torres couldn't understand why someone with an advanced degree in supply chain management was working on aircraft diagnostics instead of pursuing more prestigious assignments. Some people just settle for less, Torres declared during a break. They don't have the ambition to pursue real advancement. Jenkins smiled, remembering his own similar pronouncements about a maintenance lieutenant who turned out to be one of the most extraordinary officers in the Air Force. "Amon Torres," he said quietly, "let me tell you about the most impressive officer I ever served under. Her name was Lieutenant Riaz, and I spent 2 months thinking she was just a maintenance officer who lacked ambition." "What changed your mind?" Torres asked. "I learned that sometimes the most capable people are the ones who don't need to prove it to everyone around them, and that some of the most important work happens without recognition because the work itself is the reward." As Jenkins began to share the lessons he'd learned at Ramstein, he realized that Colonel Maya Phantom Reyes's influence was extending far beyond the maintenance bay where he'd first encountered her. Through him, and probably through others she'd mentored, her approach to military service was spreading. The understanding that excellence was its own reward, that leadership meant making others better, and that the most meaningful work often happened in the shadows. It was, Jenkins reflected, exactly the kind of legacy someone like Colonel Reyes would want. Not a monument to her own achievements, but a network of people committed to serving something larger than themselves with quiet excellence and unwavering dedication. And in teaching that lesson to Airman Torres and others who would come after her, Jenkins was ensuring that the most important thing he'd learned at Ramstein, the true worth, wasn't measured by recognition, but by the quality of one's contribution, would continue to influence military service long after his own career ended. Some legends, he'd learned, weren't about the stories people told, but about the principles people carried forward. And that kind of legacy was more valuable than any medal or commendation ever could be. In the end, Private Derek Jenkins learned that the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, distinguished not by their need for recognition, but by their commitment to excellence, regardless of whether anyone notices. Colonel Maya Phantom Reyes taught him that true leadership isn't about commanding attention. It's about quietly making everyone around you better at their jobs and more committed to shared success. Some heroes wear their medals on their chests. Others carry their victories in the lives they've changed and the principles they've instilled in those who serve alongside them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.